No one expected police cruisers to roll into the neighborhood on a calm Tuesday morning. No one expected the HOA president to make that call. And absolutely no one, not the officer stepping out of the patrol car, not the neighbors peeking from their driveways, and certainly not the HOA board itself, expected what happened when that front door slowly opened. What was waiting inside changed everything. And once you find out what the officers discovered in that house, you'll understand why this story exploded across the internet almost overnight. Before we jump in, I want to know something. Where are you watching from today? Leave your country down in the comments. I read every one of them, and it's always incredible seeing how far these HOA stories reach around the world. Now let's get started. Earl Hutchins was 74 years old and had lived in the same house on Sycamore Drive for over 4 decades. 41 years, to be exact. He had raised 3 children there. He had said goodbye to his wife there. And as far as Earl was concerned, he planned to spend the rest of his life there. His home wasn't fancy. It had a weathered porch swing, a front garden that seemed to grow a little bigger every year, and an aging dog named Biscuit, who spent most of his days sleeping in sunny spots and accepting compliments from anyone who walked by. Earl wasn't the type to cause problems. He wasn't loud. He wasn't argumentative. He greeted neighbors with a wave, paid his bills on time, and mostly kept to himself. By any reasonable standard, Earl Hutchins was exactly the kind of neighbor people hoped to have living next door. But the HOA on Sycamore Drive saw things differently. According to them, the trouble started about 8 months before the police ever arrived. That was when Sandra Bellows became HOA president. Sandra treated HOA rules less like guidelines and more like sacred law. If someone left a recycling bin out a few hours too long, she noticed. If a mailbox needed repainting, she noticed. She kept detailed records, color-coded spreadsheets, and a laminated copy of the community regulations that she carried with her more often than most people carried family photos. The moment she drove past Earl's property and saw his front garden bursting with sunflowers, climbing roses, tomato plants, and every other kind of greenery imaginable, she decided something needed to be done. The first violation notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The accusation was simple: unauthorized landscaping, vegetation exceeding approved height requirements. Earl glanced at the notice, set it on his kitchen counter, and went right back outside to water his tomatoes. He had dealt with HOA complaints before. He assumed this one would eventually disappear. It didn't. Over the next 6 months, Sandra mailed 11 additional violation notices. One complained about the garden. Another targeted Biscuit's doghouse, claiming it exceeded height restrictions by 4 inches. One cited a set of wind chimes. Another, and this was the one that actually made Earl laugh out loud, complained that the cushions on his porch swing were not part of the HOA's approved outdoor color scheme. When Earl mentioned that notice during a phone call with his daughter, she was far less amused than he was. But there was something nobody in the neighborhood knew. Nobody. Not the neighbors. Not Sandra. Not even Earl's own children. For nearly 3 years, Earl had been quietly working on something inside that house. A secret project. And that hidden detail is exactly why the story takes a turn nobody could predict it. During the 7th month of complaints, Sandra called an emergency HOA board meeting. She arrived prepared. She brought photographs. She brought records. She brought timestamps. Using her carefully organized spreadsheet, she argued that Earl's property had become a serious concern for the community. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to escalate the matter and pursue formal action. If necessary, they would even involve local authorities. Sandra had started referring to Earl's home as a hazard property. A certified letter soon arrived in Earl's mailbox. He signed for it, carried it inside, and sat at his kitchen table to read every page. For the first time since the notices began, he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached for the phone, but he wasn't calling an attorney. He called his grandson. Marcus was 26 years old, smart, observant, and had recently completed a degree in urban planning. "I need a favor," Earl told him. "Come stay with me for a few weeks. I think I might need a witness." The morning police finally arrived was cold, gray, and unusually quiet. It was a kind of morning that made everything feel more serious than it probably should have. Just after 9 o'clock, a patrol car pulled up in front of Earl's house. Sandra was already waiting outside. She stood in her driveway with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she considered the entire situation a personal triumph. A few curious neighbors wandered onto their porches to watch. Inside the house, Biscuit barked once. Then everything went silent. The officers walked to the front door. They knocked, waited, knocked again. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened, and the moment it did, both officers froze. One of them actually stepped backward, because every wall, every visible surface, and every corner they could see from the entrance was packed from floor to ceiling with something that looked absolutely unbelievable. An impossible collection of records. Every wall seemed covered with framed photographs. Shelves overflowed with binders marked by carefully labeled tabs. There were blueprints pinned to display boards, laminated neighborhood maps, and handwritten journals stacked in neat rows, documenting events that stretched back decades. And right in the middle of the living room sat Marcus. His laptop was open. Documents covered the folding table in front of him. And unlike everyone else, he didn't look surprised at all. "Morning, officers," Earl said calmly. "Please come inside. We've been expecting visitors." What nobody knew was that Earl hadn't spent the last 3 years simply tending his garden. He had spent those years building a case. Not specifically against Sandra, at least not at first. Earl had become obsessed with documenting the complete history of the Sycamore Drive HOA. He collected meeting minutes. He tracked bylaw revisions. He archived fee increases. He recorded enforcement actions. Every letter, every notice, every vote, every decision. And what he eventually uncovered was something neither Sandra nor the board ever expected anyone to find. Over the previous several weeks, Earl and Marcus had organized everything into a formal complaint package. The evidence was staggering. According to their research, the HOA had been operating without a valid state registration for more than 2 years. If that finding proved accurate, every fine issued during that period could be considered legally unenforceable. But that wasn't even the most surprising discovery. The famous color palette Sandra constantly referenced in violation notices, the one she claimed residents were required to follow, it had never actually been approved. There was no board vote, no official adoption, no recorded meeting discussion. The document existed solely because Sandra had created herself and treated it as if it were law. Earl handed one of the officers a thick manila folder. Inside was a detailed 30-page report. Copies had already been submitted to the state attorney general's office. Additional copies had been filed with the county clerk. And just 2 days earlier, a housing rights organization had agreed to represent Earl at no cost after reviewing the evidence. The officer opened the folder. He flipped through several pages. Then he looked at Earl, then back at the report, then at Earl again. Finally, he said very carefully, "Sir, we were dispatched here because of complaints regarding an unauthorized garden." "I know," Earl replied with a smile, "and I'd be happy to show it to you." He pointed toward the backyard. Best tomatoes in the entire neighborhood. The following weeks moved quickly. Every violation filed against Earl was thrown out. State officials opened a formal review into the HOA's registration status and financial practices. Board members suddenly became much harder to find. 2 quietly submitted resignations. And Sandra Bellows, who had once mailed certified warnings over wind chimes and porch cushions, soon found herself receiving legal correspondence of her own. A formal cease and desist notice arrived with her name on it. Most people assumed that was where the story ended. It wasn't, because the next discovery changed everything. When investigators and housing advocates dug deeper into the HOA's records, they found that Earl wasn't the only resident affected. Not even close. 14 additional homeowners from Sycamore Drive and neighboring streets had paid fines during the same period. Fines that appear to have no legal basis under state law. 14 families. Some had paid a few $100s. Others had paid much more. One family had handed over more than $2,000 in penalties they never should have owed. Earl decided everyone deserved to know, so he organized a neighborhood gathering, not in a meeting hall, not in a conference room, right in the middle of his garden. Neighbors gathered among the towering sunflowers and rows of tomato plants, while Earl quietly explained what investigators had found and what compensation they might be entitled to recover. For the first time in years, people compared notes. They shared stories. They realized they hadn't been alone. Biscuit slept through almost the entire meeting, but Earl spent the afternoon smiling. The garden still stands today. The wind chimes still hang from the porch, and the cushions on Earl's porch swing remain gloriously outside any imaginary HOA-approved color palette. They're bright yellow, impossible to miss, and intentionally so. As for Earl, some neighbors joke that somewhere inside his house sits a perfectly organized filing cabinet filled with folders on everything and everyone, the kind of cabinet that would make any HOA board nervous. And if you ask around Sycamore Drive, more than a few people will tell you they're convinced Earl probably has a folder with their name on it too, just in case. Now I want to hear from you. Did Earl handle the situation the right way? Or do you think he took things too far? And what would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to tell me what country you're watching from. I read every single comment.